Wyoming Territory, spring 1887. She ran through the dark, and the driving rain, one wrist in irons, one boot gone, two armed men closing in behind her. When the stranger found her hiding in his barn, his gun drawn, her body shaking, she looked up at him and whispered, "Kiss where it hurts, please. I want it so bad." He went still. "Where?" This is the story of a woman accused of murder, a rancher carrying a 5-year secret, and a powerful man willing to bury the truth forever. Follow along, because once this story starts, you won't be able to put it down. The rain came sideways. Adeline Sloan ran through it anyway. Her left boot was gone somewhere back in the creek bottom, lost when she'd yanked her foot free of the mud and kept moving. The cold hit the bare sole of her foot with every step. She barely noticed. What she noticed was the lantern light, swinging maybe 200 yards behind her, and the man carrying it hollering her name like he expected her to stop. She didn't stop. The iron around her left wrist clanged against her hip as she ran. They'd cut the chain between her wrists, but hadn't gotten the cuff off before she'd pulled away from them. Half a restraint, still locked on. Dead weight. She used her right hand to press it, quiet against her side, so the sound wouldn't carry. She could hear the creek behind her. That meant she'd come far enough north. Somewhere ahead, through the rain and the dark and the line of cottonwoods bending in the wind, there had to be buildings. She prayed to God there were buildings. Her ribs screamed when she breathed too deep. One of Rourke's men had caught her before she'd gotten clear. She'd gotten free, anyway, but she'd felt something give when she twisted out of his grip. Not broken. She was almost certain not broken. She kept moving. The fence came out of nowhere. She hit it with her forearm, grabbed the top rail before she went over, and stood there a moment, with her forehead pressed against wet wood. Rain ran down the back of her neck. The lantern behind her had stopped moving. She could hear them talking, but couldn't hear the words. She ducked through the fence and ran toward the dark shape of a barn. The mare inside was close to foaling. Addie could tell that, even in the dark, even half out of her mind with cold and pain, the animal was moving wrong, too restless, too careful with her own body. She pressed herself into the corner of the nearest stall, and the mare swung her head around and looked at her. "Easy," Addie whispered. "I'm not here for you." She sat down in the straw and pulled her knees to her chest and tried to stop shaking. Her wrist where the cuff sat had swollen badly. Her ribs pulsed with every breath. Outside, the rain hit the barn roof in waves. She heard the lantern light before she saw it. A glow under the barn door, then the door swinging open. The man who walked in was tall. He carried the lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other, and he moved quietly for someone his size. He checked the stalls from left to right without hurrying. He wasn't panicked. He was someone who'd walked into uncertain situations before and learned to breathe through them. He found her in the third stall. He stopped. He didn't raise the revolver. He just looked at her for a moment, then raised the lantern a little higher. Addie looked back at him. There was nowhere to go. She was shaking so hard, her teeth were close to chattering, and she couldn't make it stop. "Men are after me," she said. "I didn't know where else to go." He didn't answer right away. He looked at the iron cuff around her wrist. He looked at her bare foot. His expression didn't change much, but something shifted in it. "Can you stand?" he said. Yes, she wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she stood up anyway. His name was Calder Reed. She learned that later. He carried her from the barn to the house with the revolver still at his hip, and didn't ask her another question until he had her sitting beside the stove with a blanket around her shoulders. Then he crouched down in front of her and looked at the wrist with the cuff. "That needs to come off, I know." He went to get tools. She watched him go. The house was plain and clean, a working man's house. No excess in it, just what was needed and nothing wasted. He came back with a small iron chisel and a mallet and knelt in front of her again. He worked carefully, bracing the cuff against a flat piece of wood so the strike would go into the metal and not into her arm. It took 3 tries. The cuff split, and he eased it off, and Addie looked at her wrist and at the swelling there and at the dark bruising that had already spread up toward her forearm. He set the cuff aside. He didn't throw it. He set it down deliberately, like he wanted to remember what it was. He examined her hand. Her knuckles were swollen. her fingers stiff. He turned her hand over carefully in his. He wasn't rough. He wasn't gentle the way people are gentle with something fragile either. He was careful the way you are with something that matters. Addie was so tired. She had been cold for 2 days and afraid for longer than that. And she was sitting in a warm house with someone who had not yet hurt her, and the exhaustion of all of it pressed down on her until she was barely holding herself upright. She looked at her hand in his, the bruising across her knuckles, the swelling at the wrist. "Kiss where it hurts," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Please, I want it so bad," he went. Still, she felt him go still. She didn't look up. "Where?" he said. She raised her hand slightly, just enough he understood. He lifted her swollen hand and pressed his mouth gently to her knuckles, not lingering, not making it into something it wasn't. Just a brief, warm pressure, and then he lowered her hand again. Addie didn't cry. She'd thought she might. She didn't. It was just the first touch in 2 days that hadn't wanted something from her. She sat with that for a moment. Then she told him men were trying to kill her, and she'd escaped from them in the creek bottoms, and she didn't know how close they still were. He nodded slowly. "Lie down, I'll keep watch." The posse reached Black Willow Ranch maybe 2 hours later. Addie heard horses. She heard voices. She heard Calder's voice among them, steady and unhurried, and she pressed herself against the wall near the back of the house and waited. Later she would learn the man leading the search was Deputy Asa Morrell, legitimate law. She would learn that Rourke had ridden with the posse, which was how she didn't hear his voice and relax. At the time, she only heard Calder say, "Nobody's come through here, just my horses and the rain then." Quiet. The sound of the posse moving on. Calder came back inside. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. He had something in his hand, a paper, rolled and damp at the edges from where someone had held it in the rain. He set it on the table between them. It was a wanted circular. Her name on it, her description. Wanted for the murder of Dr. Harlan Vey. Addie looked at it. Then she looked at him. "You lied to them," she said. "I did." "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and looked at the paper for a moment before he looked back at her. "Tell me what happened," he said. So she told him. All of it. The night Vey died, the argument she'd had with him, the way she'd left and then come back because she hadn't been able to help herself. She told him about the back alley and the shape she'd seen there. She told him about finding Vey on the floor, her knife beside him, his blood on her hands, before she'd even understood what she was looking at. She told him about the front door and the approaching footsteps and the terrible clear knowledge that nothing she could say in that moment would matter at all. Calder listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The man who led that posse," he said. "The inspector. Rourke." Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. "What about him?" Calder looked at the table. Then he looked up. "5 years ago," he said slowly, "that man ordered a quarantine on this ranch. He stopped there. Addie waited. My brother Emmett died because of it." Outside, the rain had gentled to something steady and low. The stove made its small sounds. The pregnant mare in the barn was quiet now. Addie looked at Calder Reed and understood that she hadn't landed in a stranger's house by accident. She'd run through the dark and the rain and the mud and landed in the one place in Wyoming territory where someone already had a reason to believe her. She didn't know yet what that meant. Neither did he. But he closed the door against the rain, and she was still inside, and that was enough for now. Calder told her in the morning. He stood at the stove with his back to her, poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of her, and said it plainly. "Hiding, you can't go on forever." Addie wrapped both hands around the cup. Her wrist was wrapped in clean cloth. Her ribs still ached when she breathed deep, but the shaking had stopped sometime in the night. "I know," she said. He sat down across from her. "So we established some rules." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "You're not my prisoner," he said. "I'm not going to lock you in or post a man at the door. You want to leave? You leave." He paused. "But you don't take one of my horses to do it, I wouldn't. And if you learn something that puts this ranch in danger, you tell me. You don't sit on it." Ada set down the cup. "Those are fair terms." He nodded once. That was the end of the negotiation. She asked him what needed doing. He told her ribs needed rest. She told him rest wasn't something she was willing to afford right now, and they looked at each other across the table for a moment. And Calder seemed to decide that arguing would take more energy than it was worth. Feed room needs organizing, he said. You can do that without lifting anything heavy. She spent the first hour in the feed room and the second hour in the barn. By mid-morning, she'd found her way into the paddock where Calder kept his mares, and she was watching them move when she noticed one standing apart from the others near the north fence line. She watched the mare for a while before she said anything. The animal wasn't lame. Her gait was fine, but she was holding her head slightly low, and her eyes were watering in a way that didn't match the light, and she kept rubbing her muzzle against the fence post in a slow, repetitive motion that didn't look like an itch. It looked like irritation. Addie climbed through the fence. She approached quietly, the same way she'd been taught, giving the mare time to read her. She got a hand on the animal's neck and felt no unusual heat there. She checked the muzzle. The skin around the nostrils was red, not dramatically so, but enough. The eyes were watering without any sign of discharge in the nasal passages. The pattern was wrong. Calder found her there 10 minutes later. He came through the gate and stopped when he saw what she was doing. She been like this long? Addie asked. His face changed. She saw it happen. A careful, controlled tightening around his jaw. Few days, maybe. His voice was level. Why? What happened on this ranch 5 years ago? Addie said. What did it look like at the beginning? Calder walked closer. He looked at the mare, at the reddened muzzle, at the watering eyes. He looked at it for a long moment. Like this, he said quietly. Addie stepped back and looked at the rest of the herd. 11 other horses moving freely across the paddock. Normal gaits, normal posture. 2 of them were standing close enough to the affected mare that if something contagious was at work, they should have shown signs before now. They hadn't. I need to wash her muzzle, Addie said, and I need you to pull her away from whatever she's been eating. You think it's the feed. I don't know yet. That's why I said I need to watch her. She looked at him directly. A real contagious disease doesn't disappear because I washed a horse's face. If the symptoms ease after we separate her from the suspect feed and she's away from the others, that tells us something. It doesn't tell us everything. He was quiet for a moment. What do you need? Clean water, a soft cloth, your herd records, if you have them, and a few days of honest observation. He went and got the water. They washed the mare's muzzle together. Calder held her steady, and Addie worked carefully around the sensitive skin, cleaning away whatever residue had built up there. The mare stood for it without much protest. Afterward, they moved her to a separate stall in the barn with fresh hay from a different supply. Calder pulled the records that afternoon. Addie sat at the kitchen table and went through them while the light lasted. She noted which horses had been in, which paddocks, which feed had come, from which supplier, which animals shared water troughs. By evening, the mare in the separate stall was quieter. Her head was up. Addie didn't say anything about it. She wrote it down. Calder watched her write and didn't ask what she was thinking. He seemed to understand that she was building something careful here and that rushing it would ruin it. They ate without much conversation. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was 2 people occupied with the same problem from different angles. After dark, Calder went out to check the north fence line. He came back in without his coat, which meant he'd been out there long enough to work up some heat. And he stood at the door for a moment before he said anything. Someone's been in the north pasture. Addie looked up from her notes. Fresh tracks, he said. Not mine, not any of my hands. He came inside and closed the door. Someone walked that fence line sometime in the last day or 2. Addie thought about the mare, about the irritation concentrated precisely around exposed skin, about the feed near the spot where she'd been standing. She didn't say what she was thinking yet. She wrote it down instead. In the morning, she found it. She was checking the fence line herself, retracing what Calder had shown her, when she saw the post at the northwest corner of the property. A wooden marker had been nailed to it, not an official sign. No government seal, no dated inspection record, just a rough board with 2 words burned into the grain. Quarantine, disease. She stood looking at it for a moment. The wood was dry. It had gone up in the last 48 hours, before any official inspection had taken place. before any territorial authority had set foot on Black Willow Ranch. Someone was preparing this land to look infected. She went and found Calder. She showed him the marker without saying anything first. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he took it down and turned it over in his hands and looked at the burned letters and at the nail holes and at the dry, clean wood. He looked up at her. "Nobody from the territory has inspected this ranch," he said. "No," she said. He set the marker down against the fence post and stared out across the north pasture. The horses were moving in the morning light, healthy, easy. The separate mare, visible through the barn door, was eating steadily. Calder's jaw was tight. "Rourke," he said. It wasn't a question. The foal came before dawn. Calder hammered on the door to the room he'd given Addie and said 2 words. "She's early." Addie was already pulling on her boots. The mare was a gray, named Patience, which turned out to be a poor name for the situation. She was down, and she was struggling, and the way she was struggling told Addie what was wrong before she'd even gotten both hands on her. "The foal's positioned badly," Addie said. Calder crouched at the mare's head and kept his hands on her neck, keeping her as still as a panicked horse in labor could be kept. "Tell me what to do," he said. Addie worked. She talked while she worked, not to him exactly, just aloud, explaining what she was doing and why, because that was how Vey had taught her. Narrate the problem. Narrate the solution. If you can explain it while you're doing it, you understand it well enough to do it right. The foal was turned. She had to correct that. Carefully, working with the mare's contractions and not against them, she repositioned the animal. The mare screamed once. Calder held her head and spoke to her in a low, continuous voice. An hour later, a wet, trembling foal lay in the straw. Patience dropped her head and began cleaning her foal with the single-minded focus of a mother who had decided the crisis was over. The foal blinked. Its ears twitched. Addie sat back on her heels and let out a long breath. Calder looked across the stall at her. He was disheveled and tired, and there was sweat at his temples from the effort of holding a frightened horse steady for an hour. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once, and she understood exactly what he meant. They cleaned up in silence. The barn was quiet except for Patience moving in the straw and the small sounds the foal made finding its feet. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. Addie was washing her hands at the pump when she heard something behind her. Calder was standing with her small silver bell in his hand. She'd had it since her father died. He'd used it for years. The same bell, a particular sound the horses on their farm had learned to associate with feeding and calm handling. She'd carried it with her through everything. The leather strap that held it had torn sometime in the last several days. Probably during the night, she'd run through the creek bottoms. She hadn't mentioned it because there was nothing to do about it. Calder had found new leather somewhere. He'd cut it to fit and stitched it through the ring at the top of the bell, tight and even, with the kind of stitching that would hold. He held it out to her. Addie took it. She ran her thumb over the new strap. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged slightly, like it wasn't worth making into anything larger. She understood what it was anyway. Tomas Ortega arrived mid-morning. He was Calder's closest friend, and his blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with gray at his temples and hands that looked like they'd been shaped by ironwork because they had been. He came through the barn door, spotted Addie, looked at Calder, and accepted the situation without apparent surprise. "She's still here," he said, which wasn't quite a question. "She's helping," Calder said. Tomas sat on a hay bale and looked at the new foal, and then looked at Addie with the measuring expression of someone who had learned not to decide things quickly. Then he said, "I got something I've been carrying too long." Neither of them spoke. He pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands. He looked at Calder. "You remember Copperjack?" Calder went still. He was destroyed. During the quarantine, that's what the record says. Tomas looked at the floor. "About 8 months after the quarantine ended, I went down to a livestock sale in Carbon County. Not looking for anything particular," he paused. "I saw a gelding." He described the animal. The white shoulder patch, distinctive and high. A scar above the left hock where the horse had caught himself on wire as a young animal. An altered brand, not quite matching anything registered, but with the shapes underneath that Tomas had burned into that horse himself. And the shoe. I'd made that shoe specific to him, Tomas said. His left rear hoof was malformed. I shaped a corrective shoe for it, a design I worked out myself. Nothing standard about it. I'd never made another one like it. He looked up at Calder. That horse at the Carbon County sale was wearing my shoe. The barn was quiet. Copper Jack didn't die in that quarantine, Tomas said. He was sold. Calder stood very still with his hands at his sides. Addie had been listening without interrupting. Now, she said, Dr. Vey had been tracing horses, animals supposedly condemned and destroyed during previous quarantines. He was building a record. She looked at Calder. That was part of what he was investigating when he died. I didn't tell you before because I wasn't certain how much to say. She paused. I should have told you. Calder looked at her. The expression on his face was complicated. He was angry. She could see that clearly. Not a loud anger, the controlled kind, which is sometimes worse. He was your mentor, Calder said, and he was investigating Rourke's quarantines. And you knew that and didn't say it. Yes, he turned away and looked at the foal for a moment. Then he turned back. What else? She told him everything. Every conversation she could remember, every note she'd seen Vey make, every name he'd mentioned. She laid it out without holding anything back, because she'd made the decision the moment Tomas had started talking. Information wasn't something she could use as protection anymore. Not here. Calder listened to all of it. Tomas had gone quiet on his hay bale. He was looking at his hat. I should have said something years ago, Tomas said. I couldn't prove it. One horse, one shoe. It wasn't enough to go against a territorial inspector with. He looked at Calder. I told myself that. Calder didn't tell him he'd been wrong. He didn't tell him he'd been right, either. A hand arrived from the bunkhouse to report that 2 horses from a neighboring breeder had developed symptoms. Similar symptoms. Muzzle irritation, watery eyes, unusual agitation. Addie wrote it in her record. The pattern was getting harder to dismiss. Calder said, We don't move on Rourke without more than this. I know, Addie said. I want to, he said. I want to go to Dry Creek right now and say his name out loud in front of whoever will listen. He looked at her. But that's not what you'd tell me to do. It's not, she said. Circumstantial evidence and one identifiable horse aren't enough to destroy a respected official. Not in any court and not in any town. She met his eyes. We need more. He accepted that. She could see him accepting it, which wasn't easy for him. Tomas stood up and put his hat back on. He looked at Calder with an expression that had something grave in it, something that had been sitting with him for a long time. Copper Jack wasn't the only dead horse I saw walking, he said. They went quietly. Calder, Addie, and Tomas rode out before full light on a Tuesday, taking back roads and livestock trails that Tomas had been using for 30 years. They weren't going anywhere official. They were going to talk to men who remembered. Old sales yards, neighboring spreads. A retired stockman named Hendricks, who lived alone on a quarter section outside of Laramie and kept records the way some men kept scripture carefully, completely, and without apology. It took 3 days. What they found wasn't one clear answer. It was a pattern, and patterns are convincing precisely because no single piece of them can be dismissed as coincidence. Several horses, officially listed as destroyed during previous quarantine operations, had passed through distant livestock sales. Not the same sale, not the same season. Spread out enough to look unconnected if you were only looking at one county at a time. But Tomas had a memory for horses and a blacksmith's eye for ironwork, and Addie had Vey's method, which was to document everything and trust the accumulation. The brands had been altered, professionally done, not burned over carelessly, but reworked with enough skill to pass a casual inspection. The ownership records were thin and inconsistent. Different buyers, different intermediaries, different dates. But one name kept appearing in the spaces between those records, written on transport documents, mentioned by stockmen who remembered a particular man helping move the animals. Jacob Fenner, called Jake. Addie recognized the name on the second day when Tomas pulled it from a transport ledger at a sale yard outside of Rawlins. She said it quietly. Vey wrote that name. Calder looked at her across the ledger. Where? He said, his investigative notes. I didn't see everything, but I saw that name written down more than once, near the end before he died. She looked at the entry. Vay was trying to find him. They didn't know why yet, only that Vay had wanted to, and that Jake Fenner's name appeared wherever animals moved that shouldn't have been moving. On the third day, they rode back to Black Willow. Calder was quiet most of the ride. Addie had been around him long enough now to read the difference between his silences. This one was pressurized. They put the horses up and went inside, and Calder stood at the kitchen window with his back to her for a long moment before he said what was in him. I want to confront him. I know. We have the horses. We have the records. We have Tomas's testimony about Copper Jack. He turned around. That's not enough for you. It's not enough for a court, she said. And it's not enough for a town that already respects him. Rourke is a territorial inspector. He has authority, and he has standing, and he has 5 years of professional reputation built on top of what he did to this ranch. She kept her voice even. If we go at him now with what we have, he buries it. He explains every inconsistency, and we look like a wanted murderer and the rancher hiding her. Calder was quiet. We need Jake, she said. We need to know what Vay needed him for. Calder looked at the window. The light was going flat outside, afternoon moving toward evening. My brother thought the quarantine was wrong, he said. His voice had changed, flatter. Addie waited. Emmett kept saying the disease didn't make sense. The progression was wrong. The animals that should have been sickest were fine, and the ones that were isolated were getting worse. Calder stopped, started again. I told him to trust Rourke. I told him the man was a professional, and Emmett was 22 years old and didn't know what he was talking about. He looked at her then. So he stopped arguing with me and kept his thoughts to himself. And when the isolation barn caught fire, he went in to try to save the animals because he thought they were in there for the wrong reason. Addie didn't look away from him. He was right, Calder said. Emmett was right, and I told him he wasn't, and he's dead. She said, You're treating this like an intellectual puzzle. His expression sharpened. That's what you said to me, she told him, about being careful, about taking time, about not moving until we have enough. You think I'm doing it wrong because I'm not angry enough. I think you're doing it too carefully when people are already dead. I watched the only man who ever defended me die on a floor, she said. Her voice stayed level, but something behind it did not. And then I watched an entire town look at me and decide I'd done it because the evidence said so and because I'd run. I know what happens when you move without enough behind you. It doesn't just fail. It makes things worse. She looked at him squarely. Emmett's death isn't a theory to me either. Neither is Vay's. The kitchen was quiet. Calder turned back to the window. After a while, he said, I'm sorry. It wasn't a practiced apology. It came out rough and real. Addie sat down at the table. I know they stayed like that for a while, not talking. The space between them a little different than it had been before. Some things you can't unsay, but some things change the air for the better once they're finally out. The next morning, Calder rode out to speak to breeders he trusted, not confronting anyone, not making accusations, just talking to men who had been through quarantines and remembered the details, asking questions that seemed like ordinary neighbor conversation and weren't. Addie stayed at Black Willow. She updated her records. She checked the separated mare, who was continuing to improve in isolation. She sat with the evidence they had and looked for the gaps in it. Rourke arrived in the early afternoon. He came with 2 veterinary assistants and a territorial authority document that gave him the right to inspect any livestock operation in the county. He was polite. He was professional. He walked the paddocks with his assistants and examined several horses and made notes in a leather ledger. Addie watched from the barn. She stood far enough back to stay in shadow, and she watched Rourke examine each animal. She'd spent enough time with horses to know what a thorough examination looked like. They had taught her what you check, and in what order and why each step matters. You check temperature. You check respiration. You check mucous membranes and lymph nodes and gut sounds. And you watch how the animal holds its weight. And you look at the eyes and the coat and the way the animal tracks movement. Rourke's examination took less than a third of the time a proper one required. He moved through the paddocks quickly. He spent 30 seconds with some animals. He made notes before he'd done anything to justify them. He checked the horses he was supposed to check, and he documented what he decided before he arrived. He left within an hour. 2 hours after that, an official notice arrived by Ryder. Addie read it over Calder's shoulder when he came back. Effective immediately, Black Willow Ranch was under territorial quarantine. Calder read it twice. He set it on the table. He stood with his hand flat on the paper and breathed. Addie looked at the notice. The date, the official seal, Rourke's signature at the bottom, clean and confident. He didn't do a real inspection, she said. No, he came here knowing what he was going to write. Calder lifted his hand from the paper. We need to find Jake Fenner. The quarantine meant Calder couldn't sell. 2 buyers sent riders to Black Willow within 24 hours of the notice posting. Both of them were apologetic. Both of them were also firm. No one was going to take horses from a quarantined ranch, not with their own operations at stake. The contracts dissolved. The income they represented dissolved with them. Calder did the arithmetic that night at the kitchen table, and Addie could tell from his face that it came out the way he'd been afraid it would. She didn't ask him to share the numbers. She already understood what a quarantine did to a breeding operation. Couldn't sell, couldn't move animals, couldn't bring new stock in. Every week it held was money going out and nothing coming in, and the feed and the hands and the equipment didn't pause for official paperwork. The storm came on the 3rd day. It built through the afternoon. The sky went yellow-green in the west, and the horses started moving wrong, that restless circling that animals do when the pressure drops fast. Calder sent his hands to secure the paddock gates and check the barn roof, and Addie went with them because there was work to do, and standing inside watching wasn't something she was built for. The hail came before they'd finished. It hit without much warning, a wall of it, driving horizontal, and the horses panicked. 3 broke through a gate that hadn't latched properly. Part of the barn's north-facing wall gave way where the old timber had softened from winter moisture, and the sound of it, tearing loose, sent the remaining horses into a frenzy. In the chaos, the new foal got separated from Patience. The foal was 8 days old and small, and the noise of the storm and the panicking animals around it was too much. It pressed itself into a corner of the damaged stall where the wall had partially collapsed, and the debris from the wall was between it and the open barn, and 2 terrified mares were moving back and forth in the space between. Addie saw it. She went through the side entrance, low and fast, staying at the wall to keep clear of the horses. She reached the foal and got her body between it and the mares, and pushed the debris aside piece by piece, talking the whole time, keeping her voice steady, even though the hail on the roof was almost loud enough to drown her out. The foal pressed against her. She got it out. She got it through the side entrance and into the smaller adjoining stall that was still intact, and she latched the door and stood in the relative quiet with her back against it, and the foal pressed against her legs, shaking. Calder handled the structural danger. He was everywhere in the barn during those 40 minutes, cutting a rope that had tangled around a mare's leg, pulling a beam clear before it fell on one of his hands, forcing the broken gate section back into a position that would hold long enough to matter. He was loud when he needed to be and quiet when that worked better, and he knew every animal in that barn by name and by temperament. The 3 horses that had broken free came back on their own when the hail eased. Horses will do that. The familiar is safer than the open, even when the familiar is damaged. By the time the storm was down to ordinary rain, the barn was secure. Battered, one wall needing serious work, but secure. Every horse accounted for. Calder found Addie in the small side stall with the foal. He looked at them both, and then he looked at Addie's hands. She'd cut her right hand on the debris, a clean slice across the palm, not deep, but bleeding steadily. He went and got cloth and water without being asked. He came back and crouched in front of her and cleaned the cut carefully. The foal stood nearby and watched with the earnest attention that young animals give to everything. The scene arranged itself almost exactly as Chapter 1 had. The crouching, the careful hands, the close attention to a wound. Except that this time, Addie was fully awake and fully present, and the barn door was open, and she could walk out of it anytime she chose. She didn't move away. Calder finished wrapping the cloth around her palm and held her hand a moment longer than the task required. They were close enough that she could see the hail damp in his hair and the careful expression on his face. She recognized it now. It was what he looked like when he was working out something true. The moment was there between them. Neither of them was ready for it. She could feel that clearly. Not unwilling, not afraid exactly. Just aware that the moment deserved more than a barn after a hailstorm with mud on her boots, and a foal watching them with large, curious eyes. He let go of her hand. They sat back from each other. He said, "Tomas has something." Tomas came in from the doorway, which meant he'd been standing outside it and had the decency to wait. He'd been talking to breeders, quietly, the same way Calder had been, following the threads from the livestock records they'd traced the week before. He'd found 2 more men who had seen animals from previous quarantines turn up at sales. He'd found an intermediary who had appeared in 3 different counties, always near a quarantine operation, always moving animals in the weeks that followed, and he'd traced that intermediary's activity forward in time. The Army was buying horses, a large remount contract, purchasing hundreds of animals for cavalry use, with buyers scheduled to come through Wyoming within 2 months. It was the largest single purchase the territory had seen in a decade. Every breeding operation in the region wanted that contract. The ones under quarantine couldn't bid. "Rourke's been hitting the strongest breeders," Tomas said. "Not all of them. The ones with the best animals. The ones who'd win that Army contract straight up, in honest competition." He looked at Calder. "A supply network he controls fills the gap. That's what the moved animals were building toward. That's what Jake Fenner was part of." Addie looked at her wrapped hand. "It was never just about stealing a few horses." "No," Tomas said. He needed to eliminate the legitimate supply, force the Army buyers to work with what was available, what he made available. She looked up. He was building a monopoly. The quarantines were the mechanism. The 3 of them sat with that. The rain came down steadily outside, and the horses moved quietly in their stalls, recovered now, settling. Calder offered it that night. He said it plainly, the same way he said most things. He could give her a horse, a good one, fast and reliable, and enough money to get her into another territory with a different name, and enough time to start over before anyone tracked her that far. Addie listened to the whole offer before she answered. "No," she said. "Addie, I heard you," she said, "and I understand why you're offering it. But I'm not leaving because I have nowhere else to go. I've known where the road south was since I got here." She looked at him. "Rourke killed Vay. He stole 5 years from this ranch, and he put that iron on my wrist, and he's about to do it to every honest breeder in this territory if we let him." She shook her head. "I'm not letting him." Calder looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right," not reluctantly, like he'd been waiting to see what she'd decide, and she'd decided what he'd hoped. "Partners, then," he said. "Partners," she said. An official notice arrived the next morning. Black Willow's entire herd was scheduled for seizure and destruction. 72 hours. Calder did the math again in the morning. It came out the same. Losing the herd wouldn't just hurt Black Willow. It would end it. The breeding stock represented 15 years of careful selection. You couldn't replace that with money, even if you had the money, which he wouldn't, because the money came from the horses. He'd be left with land and buildings, and nothing to put in them. He stood at the paddock fence and looked at his animals moving in the early light, and he kept his face neutral because his hands were watching him, and they had their own worries, without adding his. Deputy Asa Morel rode in before noon. Addie went inside when she saw him coming. Calder waited at the fence. Morel was a deliberate man. He didn't rush, and he didn't perform. He tied his horse to the post and walked up and said good morning, and meant it. And then he said he had something to put to Calder that he wasn't entirely comfortable putting. "Say it anyway," Calder told him. Morel pulled a folded paper from his coat. He didn't hand it over. He held it and looked at it. "This comes from Rourke," he said. "Not officially. He asked me to carry it, and I said I would. And I want you to understand that carrying it isn't the same as agreeing with it." Calder waited. Morel laid it out plainly. Rourke couldn't offer legal immunity. He didn't have that authority, and he wasn't claiming to. What he was offering was influence with the territorial prosecutors. He knew them. He worked alongside them, and he was willing to use that relationship to argue for leniency if Addie would sign a sworn statement. "What kind of statement?" Calder said. Morrell unfolded the paper. The proposal was written in careful legal language, but the meaning was simple. Addie would swear that Vey had created the false outbreaks himself, that she had assisted him unknowingly, that Rourke had discovered the scheme only after Vey's death, and that the argument witnesses had heard between Addie and Vey had occurred because she'd uncovered what he was doing. Calder read it twice. He folded it back up. "He wants her to take Vey's reputation and burn it," he said. "Yes," Morrell said. "That's what he wants." Morrell stayed for water, and they talked for a while, and Calder noticed that Morrell was paying close attention in a way that had changed from the early days of the search. He was watching the ranch differently, listening differently. Before he left, Morrell said something quiet and careful. He said that Rourke had given an official account after Vey's death, placing himself many miles from Dry Creek on the night in question. A written account, filed with the territorial office. He said it without editorializing. Just set it down like a fact he thought Calder should hold on to. Then he mounted up and rode out. Calder went inside. Addie was at the table with her hands flat on the surface, waiting. He set the proposal in front of her and let her read it herself. She read it all the way through. Then she looked up. He said, "If it saves your life, I won't tell you not to take it." She pushed the paper back across the table. "That's what you said," she told him, "not what you meant." He looked at her. "You want me to go," she said. "You want me safely gone, so you stop being afraid of what happens to me. And this is the nearest exit you've found." Her voice wasn't harsh. It was precise. "You're trying to push me out because it's easier than admitting you care what happens." The kitchen was quiet. "That's not wrong," he said after a moment. "I know it's not." She stood up. "But I'm not signing it." She told him why. She said it in the order it mattered. Signing would destroy Vey's reputation. The man who had trained her and trusted her and died for the same investigation she was still standing inside of. It would clear Rourke of everything. It would make every false quarantine look like Vey's operation, which meant every breeder Rourke had damaged would have no legitimate claim against anyone. And once she'd signed it, once her usefulness was finished, Rourke had no reason left to protect her. "He'd keep his promise long enough to watch me sign," she said, "and then he'd find another way." Calder looked at the paper. Rourke told Morrell he was miles from Dry Creek the night. "Vey died," she said. "He filed that account officially." Morrell mentioned it. "I saw Rourke near Vey's clinic that night," she said. "I told you that in the first hour. Someone put a lie in an official record, and that record has been sitting there this whole time." She looked at him. "That matters." Calder picked up the proposal and folded it carefully and set it aside. "I'm going to refuse to surrender the herd without an independent examination," he said, "publicly, with my name on it. It'll push him the right direction." He looked at her. "And you're formally refusing the offer?" "Yes." He nodded once. Outside, the quarantine riders reached Black Willow at sunset. 6 men, official authority, polite and impersonal. They set up a camp at the property entrance. They would wait through the night and begin removing the herd at dawn. Addie stood at the barn door and watched their fire take shape in the early dark. She'd made her choice at some point in the last 2 weeks without marking the exact moment. She hadn't noticed it happening. She'd gone from running through rain toward whatever shelter existed to standing in a specific place because she'd decided to stand there. Black Willow had become something she was willing to defend. She went back inside when the dark was complete. Calder was awake when she came in. He was sitting at the table with a cup he hadn't been drinking from and an expression that told her he'd been thinking about the rifles in the cabinet. "Don't," she said. He looked up. "I know what you're considering," she said. "Shooting territorial officers makes you exactly what Rourke needs you to be. He'd have a violent rancher harboring a murderer, and the whole territory would stand behind him, and everything we've built would be gone in a day." Calder pushed the cup aside. "I know that. Then stop thinking about it." "I wasn't thinking about it," he said. "I was deciding against it." "There's a difference." She sat down across from him. Outside, the fire at the property line burned steadily. Calder looked at the table for a long moment. When he started talking, it came out like something that had been held under pressure for a long time. and had finally found the only crack available. He told her the whole truth about Emmett, not the summary he'd given her before. The real thing. Emmett had been 22 and sharp and stubborn, and he'd watched the quarantine operation from the beginning with the skeptical eye of someone who'd grown up around horses and knew their patterns. He'd come to Calder twice, said the disease didn't follow any progression he'd ever seen, said the animals isolated together weren't transmitting anything to each other the way a real contagion would, said the timing felt managed. Calder had told him to trust the professional. He'd said it more than once, said it firmly. The older brother who believed that institutions existed for a reason, and that a territorial inspector with credentials knew more than a 22-year-old ranch hand. He'd told Emmett to stop making trouble and let Rourke do his job. Emmett had stopped arguing. The night the isolation barn caught fire, Emmett went in. He went in because he believed those horses were in there for the wrong reason, and if he didn't get them out, nobody would. He died because I told him he was wrong, Calder said, and he wasn't wrong. Addie waited until she was certain he was finished. Then she said, "You cannot keep punishing yourself until the dead forgive you." He looked at her sharply. "I'm not saying that to be cruel," she said. "I'm saying it because you're letting that night make every decision for you. The way you hold your anger at Rourke, the way you wanted to pick up a rifle 20 minutes ago, the way you keep waiting for something to make it right." She didn't look away from him. "Emmett's gone. He can't forgive you. And the only person insisting you spend the rest of your life paying for it is you." He stood up from the table. She thought he was going to leave the room. He stood at the window with his back to her for a moment, and she watched his shoulders and waited. When he turned back, the sharpness was gone from his face. What was left was older and more tired and more real. A man had ridden out from a breeder's spread east of Dry Creek with information for Tomas. He'd come that afternoon, and Tomas had mentioned it at supper, almost as an afterthought. A man named Jake Fenner had been seen working near an abandoned livestock isolation station outside of town months back. The station had been used during an earlier quarantine. Nobody was supposed to be operating out of it. Addie stood up. "I'm going to find him," she said. Calder looked at her. She could see the objection forming, and she could see him decide against it. "I know I can't stop you," he said. "You're not supposed to stop me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm afraid you won't come back." It came out plain and unguarded, and she understood it cost him something to say it that simply. "I'm afraid too," she said. She meant more than the obvious danger. He heard that. He crossed the room and he kissed her. Not hurried, not desperate. Deliberate, the way he did most things. She kissed him back with equal intention, her hands against his chest, fully present. Then she stepped back. "I'll come back," she said. She left before dawn. The abandoned station was a half-day's ride east. She found Jake Fenner in the third outbuilding, an older man with a broken look about him, a man who'd been waiting to be found and dreading it at the same time. He refused to speak at first. He looked at her and said he didn't know anything about anything. She mentioned Harlanville. Jake went still. His composure didn't crack slowly. It broke all at once, like something that had been held too long in a grip that had finally given out. "I drove Rourke there that night," he said. He got no further. Outside, she heard horses. Multiple horses, moving in fast from two directions. Men's voices. Organized. She looked at Jake. He looked at the door. They came in fast and hard, and she and Jake were surrounded before she'd made it halfway across the room. 30 miles west. As the sun dropped behind the hills, Calder came out of the barn and found her horse standing alone at the paddock gate. He looked at the horse. He looked at the empty road. He reached down and picked up something from the mud at his feet. Her silver bell. The new strap Tomas had helped him sew, both broken. He stood there in the fading light and held it in his hand. The station smelled like old hay and something chemical underneath it. Addie noticed that first. Before she took stock of the room, before she counted the guards, before she assessed how badly they were situated, smell hit her, and she filed it away. Because she'd learned from Vay that details you notice, without trying, are usually the ones that matter. They put her and Jake in a back room with a heavy latch on the outside, 2 guards in the corridor, horses in the adjoining stalls, which she could hear through the thin wall, several of them moving restlessly. Jake sat against the far wall with his knees up and his hands loose between them. He looked at the floor. Addie looked at the wall between them and the horses. She could hear the animals clearly, the restless movement, the occasional sharp exhalation, the sound of hooves shifting on the same patch of ground. She recognized the rhythm. It wasn't the natural restlessness of horses in an unfamiliar space. It was the particular agitation of animals in discomfort. She pressed her hand against the wall and listened. "Jake," she said quietly. He looked up. How long have those horses been in there? He thought about it. 3 days for some. The newer ones since yesterday. Which ones are worse, he considered. The ones that were here first. She turned that over. Animals. Brought in first were showing more severe symptoms. Animals moved in later were earlier in their progression. The pattern matched what she'd seen at Black Willow, what she'd documented carefully over days. Irritation developing after exposure, not before. Concentrated on exposed tissue, not spreading horse to horse the way a contagion would spread. True infectious disease doesn't care which stall came first. It moves according to contact and susceptibility. It doesn't respect which batch arrived when. This did. He's using something on the feed, she said, or the surfaces, something that irritates the skin and mucous membranes, without causing a fever pattern or genuine transmission. She looked at Jake. That's why the inspection reports always showed sick horses and healthy horses in the same yard. You can't fake the transmission if the animals aren't actually infecting each other. Jake was quiet for a moment. Vay figured that out. Vay was building the proof of it. She sat down across from him. "Tell me what happened that night." He looked at her for a long moment. Whatever had broken open in him back at the outbuilding hadn't sealed itself back up. She could see it in his face. The particular exhaustion of a man who's been holding a secret that's heavier than he is. "I drove Rourke to Vay's clinic," he said. "It was late. Past 10 o'clock. He stopped. Looked at his hands. Rourke told me to wait with the carriage. Said he had professional business. I waited. He described what he'd heard through the clinic wall. Vay's voice first. Raised accusing. He'd had the records. Names, dates, the movement of animals that official documents said were dead. He'd traced the quarantine operations back through multiple counties, and he'd connected them to the upcoming Army contract, and he'd laid all of it out for Rourke in that room. Then Rourke's voice, quieter. Jake couldn't hear every word. Then Vay again louder, saying he would take what he had to the territorial governor's office. Then something fell, heavy like furniture. A struggle, quick and violent. Vay cried out once. After that, quiet. Rourke came out. He was straightening his coat. There was blood on his sleeve, above the cuff. He looked at Jake, and he said, "You were never here." Jake had been part of moving the animals. He'd driven carriages and signed transport documents under names that weren't quite right. He'd known what he was participating in, and told himself it was just horses, just commerce, not something anyone would die over. And then Rourke walked out of that clinic, and the calculus changed completely. "He told me what he'd put on me if I said anything," Jake said. "The whole operation. All of it. My name was on enough paper to make it stick." He looked at her. "I didn't see him do it. I heard it. I thought that mattered." "It does matter," Addie said. "And you're going to say it out loud to someone other than me." He looked uncertain. "Jake, he killed Vay for knowing what you know. You're not safer for staying quiet." He sat with that. She walked the perimeter of the room twice. The latch was on the outside, solid. The wall between them and the horses was thin board construction, old, with gaps at the lower edge. The guards changed positions every hour by the sound of their footsteps. She sat down beside the gap at the base of the wall and listened to the horses. She knew their sounds by now. She'd been working with horses for 10 years, and she'd learned to read them the way you learn to read weather, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of them. The horse nearest the gap was moving in a tight circle, agitated but not panicked, looking for direction. Addie thought about the Silver Bell, about the lead mares at Black Willow who'd learned her through it, about the way one animal following calmly gives the rest permission to follow. She began talking to the horse through the gap. Low, steady, the same tone she used when she worked. Not words that mattered, just sound, continuous and calm. The circling slowed. The horse blew out a long breath. The adjacent horse stilled. She looked at Jake. When I say go, you stay behind me, and you move fast and you don't stop. He nodded. She'd watched the guard pattern long enough to understand its gap. When the shift changed, there was a period of roughly 3 minutes where both men were briefly at the corridor's far end, exchanging information. She waited for it. When the footsteps converged at the far end, she went to work on the thin board at the base of the wall. Old wood, dried out, the nails loose from years of contraction and expansion. She worked 2 boards free in under a minute. She went through the gap. Jake followed. She moved to the horse that had been nearest the wall, put her hand on its neck. It accepted her. She got between it and the gate and opened the gate from the inside, and the horse moved forward, and the next horse followed the first. The controlled movement created exactly the disturbance she needed. Guards came running toward the stalls. The back room door swung open to find it empty. She and Jake were already out the side door. Calder was in the tree line with 2 horses. He'd ridden through the night. He didn't ask how she'd gotten out, and he didn't try to put himself between her and the guards coming around the building. He handed her the reins and they rode. Later, when they were far enough out to breathe, he looked at her, across the darkness between their horses. She looked back. We need to be in Dry Creek before sunrise, she said. I know, he said. He'd accepted it before she'd finished saying it. Whatever he'd been afraid of when he watched her ride away, he'd worked through it in the hours of riding toward her. He could stand beside her without it having to be his decision. They rode through the remaining dark. Jake told Calder what he'd told Addie. At the end of it, Calder was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The seized horses, where are they?" "Dry Creek stockyards," Jake said. "All of them. Black Willows and the others. Rourke scheduled the destruction for this morning." Addie looked at the horizon, the faintest suggestion of gray at the edge of the dark. "Then we ride faster," she said. The stockyards were full, hundreds of horses. Legitimate animals from legitimate ranches, pulled under fraudulent quarantine orders, and gathered here at the edge of Dry Creek, with official paperwork saying they needed to die. People had gathered too. Ranchers who'd gotten word, townspeople drawn by the activity, buyers who'd come for the Army contract, and found something else entirely when they arrived. The crowd was substantial and uneasy, and not sure yet what it was watching. Rourke stood near the main gate in his official capacity, unhurried, organized. His assistants moved along the fence line. His authority over the situation was, until further notice, completely legitimate. He raised his hand. Addie rode in between him and the first horse. The crowd shifted. Rourke's hand came down. He looked at her, and then looked at the people around him, and he said clearly, "This woman is a wanted fugitive. She has escaped from lawful custody and charged with murder." He looked at Deputy Morrell. Deputy. Morrell stepped forward. He looked at Addie. He looked at Rourke, he said. "I'll hear what she has to say first." Rourke's jaw tightened. Addie dismounted. She didn't begin with the murder. She began with the horses, because the horses were in front of every person standing in that yard, and the evidence was alive and visible, and she could demonstrate it directly. She asked Morrell for 5 minutes, and access to the nearest animals. He gave her both. She moved through several horses methodically, explaining each step as she performed it. Temperature first. She took it properly, explained the expected range for a horse, showing the claimed diagnosis, showed the actual readings to 2 breeders, standing nearest the fence. The numbers didn't match Rourke's documented reports. Then she looked at where the irritation appeared on each animal. Muzzle around the eyes, exposed skin at the legs. She pointed at the pattern, and she explained it. "Contagious respiratory disease spreads through respiratory contact," she said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "It doesn't preferentially attack external skin and then stop at the coat line. It doesn't spare the animals standing directly beside the sick ones for 4 and 5 days running." She moved to the next horse. "These animals are being irritated by something external, a substance on the feed or the surfaces they're exposed to. When you remove the exposure, they improve. I've documented that personally over 9 days at Black Willow Ranch." She looked at the crowd. "This is not an epidemic. This is a system." Tomas came forward from the edge of the crowd. He brought the records they'd assembled, the livestock sale documentation. the transport ledgers. He described Copperjack in the plain and specific language of a man who'd put a custom shoe on that horse himself. And he described seeing that horse alive at a sale in Carbon County 8 months after the quarantine records said the animal was dead. 2 other breeders stepped forward. One had seen a mare. One had records showing an intermediary's name appearing across 3 separate quarantine operations in 2 counties. Rourke said, "This is fabricated testimony from a fugitive and her confederates." Morrell said, "Let them finish." Jake stepped forward. He took his hat off. He stood in front of a crowd of 200 people, and he looked at the ground for a moment, and then he looked up. He said he had transported horses under false documents during 3 quarantine operations. He named the operations. He named the dates. He admitted his part without softening it. Then he said he had personally driven Dr. Lucien Rourke to the clinic of Dr. Harlan Vey on the night of Vey's death. He described waiting with the carriage. He described what he'd heard through the wall, the accusation, the struggle, the single cry, the silence. He described Rourke walking out with blood on his sleeve and saying 4 words. The crowd was very quiet. Morrell looked at Rourke. "You filed an official account, placing yourself out of the county that night." "That account is accurate," Rourke said. "This man says he drove you there himself. This man is a criminal looking for leniency." Morrell said, "That may be true. It's also a direct contradiction of your filed account, and that's enough for me to detain you pending further investigation." He looked at 2 of his men. "Take him." Rourke looked at the situation around him. The crowd, the breeders, Morrell's men moving. He looked at Jake. He drew his revolver and fired. The shot missed Jake and hit a man standing behind him in the shoulder. The man went down hard. The crowd broke apart. People scrambling. Rourke turned toward the nearest pen. "Burn the pens!" he shouted at his men. They looked at each other. Several of them stepped back. Rourke grabbed a lantern from the fence post himself and threw it into the nearest haystack. The fire caught immediately. Wind took it into the dry feed along the fence line and then into the wooden pen structures, and the horses began screaming. Addie was already moving. She pushed through the crowd toward the side-loading corridor, the long covered passage used to move animals in and out without exposing them to the open yard. She pulled the silver bell from her coat. 1 mare was near the corridor entrance. Addie rang the bell. The mare's head came up. She knew that sound. Addie had used it at Black Willow through 9 days of feeding and treating and calming. The mare took 2 steps toward it. A second horse followed the first. Addie moved backward through the corridor, ringing the bell steadily, and the horses came, one following the next, the calmer animals giving the panicked ones something to move toward rather than against. They streamed through the corridor and out the far end, away from the crowd, away from the fire. Calder broke the lock on the last corridor gate with a fence post and pulled it open. He pulled trapped handlers clear of the smoke and debris. He moved through the chaos without losing his footing. Rourke ran. He made it to the far side of the yard before Calder reached him. They went down together. Rourke was bigger than he looked and desperate, and the fight was not brief. Calder got him against the fence and held him there, and he had the angle and the leverage to make one decision or another. He made the one that let him walk away clean. He held Rourke there until Morrell arrived. When Morrell's men had Rourke restrained and Calder stepped back, his hands were shaking from the exertion and from what he'd chosen not to do. He'd let go of Emmett's weight in that moment. Not forgiven Rourke, not forgotten Emmett, just refused to let the debt keep deciding for him. The fire was controlled within an hour. The horses were out. When it was over, Calder found Addie beside an exhausted mare at the far end of the corridor. The mare's head was down. Addie's hand was bleeding again, where the bell's metal edge had cut her palm. Calder knelt beside her. He looked at her hand. He said, "Where does it hurt?" 4 months passed. The territory moved at its own pace, and the investigation moved with it, deliberately and without shortcuts. Jake gave investigators what he'd given the crowd in the stockyard, and then he gave them more. Routes, timing, the specific location where Rourke's carriage had stopped, the direction Rourke had walked from it. Investigators found the stable workers who remembered the carriage. It wasn't difficult once they knew where to look. Two men at a livery, 3 streets from Vay's clinic, recalled a territorial carriage that evening. One of them remembered the time because he'd noted it in the stable log. Another witness, an elderly woman who lived above a shop on the relevant street, remembered the carriage waiting because it blocked the view from her window, and she'd been irritated by it. These people hadn't come forward before because nobody had given them a reason to. Nobody had known to ask them. Jake's account told investigators precisely where to look, and ordinary people with ordinary memories filled in what had been invisible. The case assembled itself the way honest cases do, not dramatically, piece by piece, each piece connecting to the next. Jake placing Rourke at the clinic. Jake hearing the confrontation and the struggle, blood on Rourke's sleeve. The false alibi in the official record. Corroborating witnesses placing the carriage at the location. Rourke's clear motive established through the independent evidence of the quarantine fraud. His attempt to shoot Jake in front of 200 witnesses. His deliberate destruction of evidence at the Dry Creek stockyards. The trial ran for 11 days. Addie didn't attend every session. She had work. Rourke was convicted. The murder of Harlan Vay. Attempted murder. Livestock fraud across 4 counties. Conspiracy. Destruction of evidence. The sentence was delivered on a Thursday morning in a Cheyenne courtroom, and it was the kind of sentence that meant he would not come out the other side of it. No escape, no appeal pending, no one left above him pulling strings. His arc was finished. Jake admitted his involvement fully and accepted a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. He didn't ask for immunity, and he didn't receive it. He stood before the court and said what he'd done and accepted the consequence. And there was a quiet dignity in that which Addie recognized, even though it cost him. His arc closed with weight on it, but it closed. Several horses were returned to their former owners in the weeks following the trial. The process was slow and imperfect, as these things are. Some animals couldn't be traced with certainty. Some had been sold again, and the chain was too long to follow cleanly. Copper Jack came home to Black Willow. Calder was in the paddock when Tomas brought him in. He watched the old gelding walk through the gate, the white shoulder patch, the scar above the hock, the particular way he moved on the corrective shoe. Stood at the fence for a long time. Then he rode out to Emmett's grave. It was a simple marker at the edge of the east pasture, where Emmett used to sit in the evenings when the work was done. Calder got off his horse and stood at the foot of it and took his hat off. He said, "You were right." The wind moved through the grass. Nothing else. After a silence, he said, "I'm done making you pay for being gone." He stood there another moment. Then he put his hat back on and walked back to his horse and rode home without looking back. The guilt didn't vanish. Grief doesn't work like that, and Calder knew it. But he'd stopped asking it to drive. Addie's name was cleared in the same week the verdict came through. Formal dismissal of all charges, documented and filed and made part of the official record. Her name appeared in the territorial newspaper once in a factual account of the investigation, described as the veterinary professional whose medical analysis had formed a central part of the evidence against Rourke. Vay's surviving relatives sent a package to Black Willow. Inside were his veterinary instruments, old and precise and well-maintained. There was a letter with them, written in Vay's handwriting, dated several months before his death. The letter contained no evidence, no revelations, no final clues. It was a personal letter, written to her and set aside in the event that something happened to him before he could say it in person. He wrote that he had watched her develop from a careful student into a skilled practitioner, and that her instinct for observation, the willingness to document what she saw, rather than what she expected to see, was the rarest quality in their profession. He wrote that he believed she would build a practice and a life of her own, and that he hoped she would not let fear make her smaller than she was. Addie read it twice and put it away, and didn't speak about it for several days. Several employment offers arrived. A livestock operation in Colorado wanted a resident veterinary professional. A town in the Northern Territory had been without any qualified animal doctor for 2 years. A breeders' cooperative forming near Laramie needed someone to establish protocols and train new hands. Real offers, good ones. Addie considered them with the care they deserved. She left Black Willow for 3 weeks. She rode south first, then east, meeting with the people who'd written to her. She asked questions and listened to answers and looked at the operations and thought about what she wanted her work to mean and where she wanted to do it. Calder didn't ask her to come back. She'd made it clear before she left that asking would change something, and he'd understood that. He worked. He repaired the barn wall. He established Black Willow's place in the cooperative supply arrangement that several honest Wyoming breeders had organized to fill the legitimate gap Rourke's operation had left. It wasn't a windfall. It was steady, fair work with people he respected, supplying animals whose quality he could stand behind. New regional procedures passed through the territorial office, requiring independent review before any inspector could order the mass destruction of a herd. It wasn't perfect legislation. It was better than nothing, which is how most good changes arrive. One afternoon in late September, Calder heard the bell. He was working on a fence at the east edge of the property. He stopped and listened. He knew that sound. He set down his tools and walked back toward the barn. Addie's wagon was in the yard, a solid wagon, well loaded, veterinary instruments in a fitted case, medical supplies organized and labeled, books, several crates of them, personal belongings. She was standing beside it. He looked at the wagon. He looked at her. "Passing through?" he said. "No," she said. She told him what she had in mind. A treatment room beside the foaling barn, properly equipped. She would see animals from Black Willow and from neighboring operations. She'd charge fair rates and keep her own accounts and run it as her own professional practice. She wanted a genuine arrangement, not charity. She wanted partnership in the full sense of the word. She'd looked at the other offers, and she'd been honest with herself about why she was here instead of there. And she was done pretending the reason was purely practical. Calder said, "All right," she said. "Is that it? What else do you want me to say?" She thought about it. "Nothing, I suppose." While they were unloading the wagon, she caught her old, scarred hand on the edge of a wooden crate. She winced and pulled it back. Calder saw it. "Where does it hurt?" he said. She raised her hand, the same scar at the knuckles that had once carried an iron cuff. "Right here," she said. He looked at her. "Want me to kiss it?" She smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." He kissed her knuckles. The gesture was the same as it had been in his kitchen on a rainy night in spring. The hands were the same. The care was the same. Everything else was different. That first night she'd been a fugitive at his mercy, cold and accused, and dependent on the decision of a stranger. Now she had offers she'd declined, and money she'd earned, and a wagon she'd packed herself, and a choice she'd made with full knowledge of every alternative. She still chose him. He showed her the treatment room the next morning. He'd done the finish work while she was gone. Solid construction, good light from the east-facing window, shelving built to her specifications from a drawing she'd left with him. Her father's silver bell hung above the doorway. She looked at it for a moment. She reached up and rang it once. In the months that followed, Black Willow found its rhythm. The treatment room opened. Word spread in the practical way of small communities, one neighbor telling the next. Addie worked. Calder worked. They argued about small things and agreed on the important ones and learned each other's silences and built something that belonged to both of them equally. Copperjack grazed in the east pasture with the younger horses. He was old and slow and completely content. The new foal from that spring storm grew into a rangy, curious yearling who had inherited Patience's habit of investigating anyone who entered the paddock. In the mornings, when the light came in flat and golden from the east and the horses moved through the spring grass, the silver bell made its small sound above the treatment room door. Calder would come across the yard toward her. She would turn toward him. Two people every day, choosing the same direction. That was all it was. That was everything. And that's the end of Addie and Calder's story. But before you go, I want to sit with you here for just a moment because this story wasn't really about a murder charge or a corrupt inspector or even a Wyoming ranch on the edge of ruin. Those were the bones. The heart of it was something quieter and a whole lot harder to come by. Addie Sloan ran through the dark with nothing. No boots, no allies, no one willing to believe her word over a respected official's signature. And the first thing she did when she found safety wasn't fall apart. She observed, she documented. She built her case one honest detail at a time, because Vey had taught her that the truth doesn't announce itself. You have to earn it through patience and precision and the willingness to keep looking even when the evidence is uncomfortable. That's the first thing this story gives us. Evidence isn't dramatic. It's cumulative. One inconsistency means nothing. Two means pay attention. 10, assembled carefully over time, means something that a courtroom can't ignore. Whether you're fighting for your reputation, your livelihood, or just trying to make sense of something that feels wrong, the discipline to observe before you act and to document before you accuse is one of the most powerful tools a person can carry. The second thing is what Calder had to learn the hard way. He spent 5 years letting guilt drive every decision he made. He trusted the wrong man once, and his brother paid for it. And Calder decided the only fair punishment was to carry that weight forever. But guilt without direction isn't loyalty to the dead. It's just damage spreading outward. Addie said it plainly, you cannot keep punishing yourself until the dead forgive you. The people we've lost can't release us. Only we can do that. And releasing the guilt doesn't mean forgetting. It means deciding that the living deserve the rest of us, not just the part that survived. The third thing this story is about is choice, real choice. The kind that only counts when you have genuine alternatives. Addie had offers, good ones. She had her name back, her professional reputation restored, a wagon packed and ready, and multiple roads open in front of her. She could have gone anywhere. She came back to Black Willow because she wanted to, not because she needed to. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in a relationship. Love that comes from dependency isn't the same as love that comes from decision. One of them traps you. The other one sets you free and then watches you walk toward it anyway. And finally, this story reminds us that the people willing to stand beside you when standing cost them something. Those are the ones worth standing beside in return. Calder lied to the law for a woman he'd known for 2 hours. Not because he was reckless, because something in the situation told him the official version wasn't the whole truth, and he was willing to risk being wrong about that. He was willing to trust his own judgment even when every piece of paper in the territory said otherwise. In a world where authority is sometimes corrupt and institutions sometimes fail the people they're meant to protect, that kind of quiet moral courage, the courage to say something is wrong before you can prove it, is rarer and more valuable than it looks. Addie and Calder didn't ride off into a perfect sunset. They built something, slowly, imperfectly, with disagreements and old wounds, and the daily work of two stubborn people learning to share a life without either one of them shrinking to fit. That's not a fairy tale ending. That's better. That's the real thing. Thank you for spending this time with their story. If it gave you something to think about, or just gave you a few hours somewhere else entirely, then it did exactly what a good story is supposed to do. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or historical events is coincidental.